Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today what I'm going to do is provide a footnote on my discussions on American presidents so that we can properly contextualize the percolating undercurrents that formed America. In a recent video, I talked about how Georgia was started as a penal colony in 1732, with the first governor being Lieutenant General James Oglethorpe. Now, in establishing that Georgia was a penal colony, well, I'm not saying that the ancestors of our 39th president, Jimmy Carter, were that his ancestors were former convicts, right? In fact, the ancestors of President Jimmy Carter, his first immigrant ancestor was a Thomas Carter, who immigrated to the colony of Virginia in about 1635. Eventually, he migrated to sorry he migrated excuse me to um, migrated to the Carolinas and eventually Georgia, where he established himself and his descendants established themselves as farmers. Um, However, uh, the purpose of my discussing American presidents and, of course, the footnote to American presidents is not to create hagiography or propaganda regarding America's origin story. Um, Normally, all we get about America's origin story is from the Pilgrims at Plymouth. Those are just one set of immigrants, right, that came in 1620. There were other colonies, we had 12 other colonies. And apart from that, we had other colonies that came about through various acquisitions and like the Louisiana Purchase. And of course, they've become part of the American fabric. And so today I'm going to, touch on two other colonies. That's the New York colony and, of course, the Louisiana colony, from the Louisiana Purchase. So I'm going to start with New York. Now, so I've talked about the Dutch, and I'm glad I did not digress into the creation of the New York colony. At the time, I mentioned, the English king William of Orange, who actually was also the ruler of Holland during the time of the Glorious Revolution in 1688, and his wife being the daughter of King James II, Mary, and they jointly ruled England. Um, so it's interesting that uh, the British you know, have had a Dutch king, right? A king from Holland. Now, because in about 1664, the English seized the Dutch colony of New Netherlands, and New Amsterdam was its capital. So Netherlands was seized by the New Netherlands was seized by an English fleet in 1664, and the Dutch did not fight. They gave it up easily, and it was renamed New York in honor of the Duke of New York. That's James, the Duke of York. James would go on to become James II, the English King James II. That James II is the same one who was overthrown. I've done a previous video about how he was blindsided by the Parliament, and he had to flee to France under the protection of King Louis XIV of France. And while the Parliament welcomed the ruler of Holland, William of Orange, and his wife, who was the daughter of King James II, they welcomed both of them to be joint rulers, joint monarchs of England. And so, talk about winning the battle and losing the war. So, That's how New York came to be British. But its establishment goes back to the 1620s. Um, Hudson is famous because he did an exploration in 1609, but he was sponsored by the Dutch, right, by a Dutch company. Now, so I've done an earlier video about how the Dutch Republic broke away from the suzerainty of Spain in 1579 with the Union of Utrecht, and they established a republic, the Dutch Republic, Republic of the uh, Seven United Netherlands. Uh, Something that's also interesting is the Dutch went on to establish the first, what's said to be the first multinational corporation in the world. It's called the Dutch East India Company. It's also said to be the first company whose stock was traded on the stock market. So the Dutch also established the first stock exchange in Amsterdam, in Holland. So you can see the influence and the legacy of the Dutch in New York, because we know New York is known for its big corporations. New York is known for Wall Street, the stock exchange. So those are influences of the Dutch. But apart from that, the Dutch also left all the influences like their tolerance, their religious tolerance, their multiculturalism, uh, a spirit of free enterprise. So the Dutch East India Company was actually the uh, the richest company in the world. It had quasi governmental powers. And in fact, they say till today it remains, in present day dollars, they say it remains the most valuable, wealthiest company in the world. That if it had existed till today, it would be worth $7 trillion. That's the Dutch East India Company. So the Dutch East India Company was created actually to operate in the East Indies, that's in Asia, to get a monopoly of the spice trade. The spice trade was very important in the Middle Ages. Remember, it's the spice trade that Christopher Columbus, who was from Genoa, an Italian from Genoa, and he contracted with the king and queen of Spain, that's Ferdinand and Isabella, to be able to get a route to this spice trade. And he stumbled serendipitously for them, for European merchants and adventurers. He stumbled upon the New World, the Americas, and he found gold, and they established colonies. Now, this set off a new form of rivalry and wars amongst European powers, so that England and Holland, not to be excluded, started trying to check and contain the power of Spain in the New World. So they became copy, they would copy one another and rival one another. And so Spain had its colonies. So of course England also came and established their colonies in Jamestown. And of course the Dutch also came and established their colonies, and the French as well. I'll talk about the French later on. So the Dutch established the colonies of the New Netherlands, and the purpose under another company. It's another company. It wasn't the Dutch East India Company. Now, the Dutch East India Company, by the way, they were granted a charter by the Dutch government, and they operated like a country. They had they had armies, right? I mean, this was a company that had armies, had judicial powers. They could actually try, natives of lands of wherever they were operating in, and they could actually convict them. They could execute convicts and things like that. So they had powers like a government, granted by after this charter was granted by um, by the Dutch government, and you can see other countries um, followed suit. I'm originally from Nigeria. I'm an American citizen, but originally from Nigeria, and so I know Nigerian history very well. Apart from the fact that I also have a degree from a Nigerian in history and international studies, economic history is as a specialty from a Nigerian university as well. So of course, Nigeria was also founded through one of these companies, a British company called the Royal Niger Company, also known as the United Africa Company. It went through a series of changes. That company still exists today because it was now absorbed by Unilever, right? Unilever still exists today. So the Royal Niger Company created Nigeria. Uh, they ostensibly were there to end the slave trade in the areas, the kingdoms in West Africa around the area of Nigeria, what that came to be known as Nigeria, and to persuade or coerce or whatever the natives or the indigenous people to engage in cash crops, other crops for trade like palm oil, cocoa, and whatnot, instead of the trade in human beings, of course, which involved the transatlantic slave trade. Now, let me move back to the Dutch and their colonization in the Americas. So the Dutch, uh, for the colonization of the Americas, created the Dutch West India Company. Now, their charter goals were to colonize the Americas, and to challenge the claims of Spain and England in the Americas that were moving into those into the Americas. And this was established in the 1620s, by the way, by around 1621. So and also uh, to gain dominance in the transatlantic slave trade from West Africa, and to establish to secure slaves from West Africa, and in privateering. So you can see the companies that were involved in the slave trade, and what was going on. So this was the charter of the Dutch West India Company that created uh, the colony of New Netherlands. New Netherlands, when it was captured by the British fleet, they changed it to New York. So New Netherlands, actually, with its capital in New Amsterdam, they covered the area of what today is New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Delaware. So you can see how these other territories came to be part of the British Empire. And their charters were not, they now became um, crown colonies under the British King. So that's with regard to the establishment of New York. And so that's how we know the legacy of the Dutch. And of course, they've given us a few presidents, including Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren had been the vice president of Andrew Johnson. And Martin Van Buren was one of the co-founders of what came to be the Democratic Party, the Jacksonian Democratic Party. And Martin Van Buren is our only president who actually uh, spoke English as a second language. So Dutch was the first language he learned, and he was from New York. So that was Martin Van Buren. Also, uh, the Roosevelts. Right? Teddy Roosevelt was Dutch descent, and of course Franklin Delano Roosevelt is Dutch descent. Many people think that Reagan was Dutch descent because his nickname was Dutch. No, Reagan is actually Irish, right? He's Irish descent. People also think Eisenhower is Dutch descent, but Eisenhower is actually German descent. His name, Eisenhower was German descent. In fact, they say that's the reason why they probably made him commander. It would cause the Germans to identify with him during the Second World War. So Eisenhower was the supreme commander of the Allied forces. So that's how New York and the Associated States came to be part of the colonies held by England and ultimately part of America. Now, I had talked about Georgia being a penal colony. It's not the only state that was a penal colony, even though there's often that caveat that the prisoners, ex-convicts that were going into Georgia were not actually hardened criminals, but people who had been in debtors' jails. They had been incarcerated because of debt, and they went that Georgia was established for them so that they could work off and pay off their debts and start a new life in the Americas. Of course, there were many restrictions placed on them. By the way, Georgia was named after King George II. So there was also Louisiana. Louisiana was actually a penal colony. It was started as a penal colony in 1719, but this was when it was part. It was a part of the French Empire. It was a colony of the French government. So in 1719, France established Louisiana as a penal colony. Now, America came to get Louisiana, Orleans, through the Louisiana Purchase under President Thomas Jefferson in 1803. And of course, Louisiana became a state in 1812. Um, so, as of the time uh, Louisiana became a colony, as of the time that Louisiana was purchased through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, a third of the population were uh, African slaves, and at the time of the Civil War, about 330,000 of them were Africans. But in the beginning, as of around, in the early 18th century, when it was being populated, they had a problem in populating the state, the colony. So it was sort of set up as an experiment, and the French were just there trying to establish a colony in order to challenge Spanish and British hegemony, right, in the Americas. But the French, nobody in France wanted to go and live in the Americas in this new world. So nobody in France wanted to go there, and of course, they were still under the Ancien regime, and so, they had the nobility. No noble person was going to go there. They were the people who could know, and then there were the peasants. The peasants would rather, be in there, be working on the lands, no matter how hard things were. They they didn't want to be carted off to in a ship, not knowing where they were going to. So the French government actually forced um, convicts, people who were in prisons, criminals, people they labeled undesirables, forced them on ships and just deported them to Louisiana to populate the colony and forced them into labor to produce tobacco, cotton, and sugar that they could use in their trade. So just as the Americans so just as the Dutch and the British had set up their respective companies, like the Dutch had the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch West India Company, which was operating in America, in the Americas. The French also had their own company uh, that was uh, that was overseeing their colonial efforts. This was actually led by a man called John Law. John Law he was actually a Scottish man, and his wife came from the nobility. He himself was a descendant of bankers and goldsmiths. By the way, the early bankers in Europe had been goldsmiths, right? The goldsmiths were the ones who became early bankers because the goldsmiths were the ones who made gold coins. So and people kept their money in safekeeping with them. So he was a Scottish man. He had been convicted for murder in London, and he fled because he killed a man in a duel. He was married to English nobility. and so he moved around. He lived in Amsterdam for a while, and of course, Amsterdam, where had the first stock exchange, a booming exchange. At that time, Amsterdam had the most vibrant ports in the world. So the Dutch were very known in England, in Europe, for their enterprising nature. They're very known, they were known for their very enterprising nature. So they didn't have the feudal system anymore because they'd broken up. They were a republic and they were very enterprising. And so I'd mentioned that they created the first um, trading company. Sorry, the first trading company that sold shares, whose shares were traded on the stock market, and that was the Dutch East India Company. So of course, other a lot of speculators were attracted to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, and one of them was John Law. So John Law, through his contacts, he had a contact with the regent of France, who was Duke of d'Orleans, or he was regent of France. A regent is he was acting in custody. He had custody. He was acting in place of the future king of France because he was a minor. So this person was his friend, and he made him the controller general of France. So that's person in charge of their finances. And so John Law established a bank. He had a bank, and also he established a company called the Mississippi Company, and he was speculating in land in the Americas. One of amongst the land was in Louisiana and New Orleans, and of course in the products from those lands, sugar, tobacco, cotton. And so he established a trading company that was traded called Mississippi Company. It was eventually changed to the Indies Company. And so he got support from the French government. And at one time, John Law actually became the richest man in Europe. But it's ironic that he also died impoverished. So there was a lot of speculation, and so he was trading these shares in France, on the French exchange, getting I guess the initial. So in America, the stockbrokers, the investment banks, they sell pitch books and they market shares for people to come and buy shares. So, and of course they do a lot of marketing. So I guess that was sort of the precursor of this sort of marketing of shares. And so people went wild. There was a huge bubble on the shares that John Law was selling. Eventually, the bubble burst, and there was inflation. He was fired as controller general of of France, and he had to flee France. He moved around. He died in Venice. At one time, London let him come back. He was pardoned in London, and of course, he eventually died in Venice, a poor man. It's kind of ironic. But what's important about what John Law did with regard to the Americas was that he he got the government to force to just arrest people that were labeled undesirables in France and the street of Paris, and just deport them to Louisiana, and trick a lot of people about the promise of starting a new life, in this Louisiana, which was a terrible place. And of course, at that time, they were just swamps. So they in fact, there was a ship called La Mutiny in 1719. They gathered 132 prostitutes in Paris, in the streets of Paris, women who were labeled petty criminals. This has been disputed, though. There's a woman, Joan, what's her name? Joan Dijon. She's a professor, and she wrote a book called was it Mutinous Women? You can look it up, and she challenged the notion that the women who were deported, forced from France to come and populate the Louisiana colony, uh, were falsely accused that they were just marginalized women in France. And so, because they were marginalized, the authorities just forced them, just arrested them, and falsely accused them on dubious charges, saying they were petty criminals or accused them of being prostitutes without any evidence. But in any event, many of these women were forced to marry the convicts because um, the men who populated Louisiana under French rule were convicted criminals, right? So they just deported convicted criminals from France. Deported all sorts of poor people, people they categorized as undesirables, deported them and forced them to work, in Louisiana, and forced these women to marry the convicted criminals so that they could populate Louisiana and have children, create children. Um, so that's part of the strange history of Louisiana. Again, so the Louisiana Purchase, of course, it was executed under Thomas Jefferson in 1803. They already had slaves. Slaves had already been introduced under French rule. And what's funny is that initially the Native Americans were used as slaves by the French, and eventually they introduced African slaves. So of course, from the Louisiana Purchase. Among states that came out of the Louisiana Purchase, interestingly, is the state of Arkansas. Of course, we've had a president from Arkansas, and that's Bill Clinton. That's not to say that Bill Clinton is a descendant uh, of the convicted criminals and the contestants or prostitutes or petty criminals or female petty criminals that were wrongfully deported to populate the Louisiana colony. So, in any event, this is not to, when we go into history and we talk about how our country came about and we provide the good, the bad, that doesn't mean we're demonizing, our nation. In life, there are always pros and cons. I remember when I first went to work at a bank, we were required to evaluate our peers, even our boss. And I don't know if that's true, but the evaluation required us to say positives and negatives, that there'll always be strengths and there'll always be weaknesses, not just one side. We were required to at least be able to give one of each, that everyone had opportunity for growth, right? And there's nothing that's perfect. And just the same thing as our country. In fact, our constitution said, that we're trying to form a more perfect union. We didn't say our country was perfect, right? So that's also what history is. We look at the undercurrents, and so we can properly understand how we are today. So normally when people are talking about the origin story of America, they talk about the pilgrims, like all the European immigrants who came to America were Christian pilgrims. That's not the case. We've had penal colonies that are part of America, and everybody sort of uses the history of Australia. At least that's very common in America. They sort of use it to lambaste Australians, saying, "Well, that was a penal colony. They were, convicts and things like that." In fact, while I was wrongfully detained, I have my own story. For instance, I've been to jail wrongfully without a trial, even while I was a federal government employee holding a top secret clearance. I've never committed a crime. I wasn't committing any crime. I was removed from my home. The police committed a crime, removing me from my home without an arrest warrant, right? So that's a false narrative. So the state of Maryland started to construct a false narrative for their own dubious reasons, right? To cast aspersions on my character. But of course, I guess to say my own narrative and say what exactly happened. And that's part of a reason why I've been doing these videos, because I'm still wrongfully detained. I've been wrongfully detained. It's going on 3 years now, and prevented from working by a corrupt criminal justice system, including a corrupt judge in Montgomery County, Maryland, Judge James Bonifant of Montgomery County, and a corrupt state attorney's office. So they've used false charges to demonize me, uh, you know, and of course the world has changed. I mean, it's no longer where you just get one side. One side, the side that has all the power, all the resources, the strength, they can just tell their narrative, they construct their false narrative without the underdog having an opportunity to tell their story. The reason I'm saying this is, well, there was, we know that there were forced deportations by the French colony, sending people they labeled undesirables to the to Louisiana, even forcing the women to marry convicts. But those women were marginalized groups, and so they couldn't tell their story. And now, a researcher, Joan Dejean, when she did her research, her studies on the La Mutiny, the 132 women from the La Mutiny, and she found, well, there was no evidence that these women were prostitutes or were petty criminals. At least, or not all of them. Some of them were innocently accused women, and they were brought here wrongfully. Um, and so, yet we have this origin story uh, of the Pilgrims in who landed in Plymouth, of course, and which became the origin of our Thanksgiving. We don't talk about these other stories. We left out the origin of New York as actually having been established by the Dutch in the 17th century, right? We don't we leave out these other stories, and this is not to say. And one of the ways that we can actually understand the sort of people who came to America is from history and the stories, the narratives that were being told. While I was wrongfully detained, I read Hard Times, written by my favorite novelist, Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens' father, Charles Dickens had experienced debtor's prison because his father had been jailed for owing, for debts he couldn't pay. So, of course, we know his story, or you can read up his story about his hardship. And of course, he was an autodidact. He read, and that's the part of the uh, British resourcefulness, because he didn't go to college, and he was someone who was working in a poorhouse, but he makes himself one of the best novelists, known to history. His only rival, I'd say, is William Shakespeare. Um, so one of the things he wrote he gives us a story in Hard Times. I read Hard Times while I was wrongfully detained. Hard Times talks about a guy who came from a middle class family, and he committed a crime. Uh, and so, rather, as an alternative to him going to prison, he was made to, he went off to America, right? So you see, these tales are common. People, in history, America's history, early colonists, not all of them were Puritans. There were also many people who were convicts, who were escaping, not just escaping persecution, but maybe they had killed people, right? And they came to the Americas. Maybe they had committed crimes. In fact, I talked about a guy, a journalist, James Callender, who was wanted in England. He had been convicted. He was, but he fled England. Uh, you know, that's James Callender during the time of Thomas Jefferson. Uh, so our colonists, our founding fathers, our colonists, not founding fathers, but the early Americans, they had their different stories and different narratives on why they came to America. Well, I want to cut this off here. I've accomplished what I wanted to do regarding a footnote to the American presidents, to just contextualize the various undercurrents that were percolating and eventually formed, uh, the Great American Republic. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I like talking about American presidents. I also draw attention to color of law violations that I've been experiencing in the state of Maryland, pivoting on subordination of perjury and fraud on the courts in order to cover up the swatting and obstruction of justice that I suffered in my home on May 16, 2023. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.